So Paicines Ranch is a 7,600 acre historic Mexican land grant ranch. We're the senior water right in the county, which means we're the first piece of property that was ever deeded in San Benito County in, I believe, the 1830s, maybe it was the 1840s. The 7,600 acres encompass about 7,000 acres of rangeland, 500 acres of irrigated crop ground, and then sort of additional event space and infrastructure. We're standing out right now with our flurd. We have about 400 moms and their babies, and then only about 10 cattle. But that'll grow. That ratio will change over time. Reason you want to have sheep and cattle together, they have different diets, and therefore they have different dung and they have different urine, and the complexity that they can add through their diversity out in this rangeland is going to have positive feedback loops with all the ecology and all the functionality. So we are standing in a space we affectionately call the front field because it's at the front of the place. It's about 300 acres, and the overwhelming majority of this was in vineyard for decades. It was just one big block of Cabernet Sauvignon, and it was tilled and sprayed to Kingdom Come. And then the section we're standing in right now actually was a reservoir, so we're on an old lake bed. The combination of those two things means that the total functionality of the historic rangeland that was here was severely diminished. And what we're attempting to do here is through grazing management, through overseeding, a couple of different little experiments, we're trying to build back that functionality. So historically, because of the lake bed effect, because of all the tractor passes, you have this very, very severe hard pan of compaction. We also have greatly diminished diversity in species of the plants that are up here. And we see them on the fringes, out on the fields. You can find some of the purple needlegrass, some saltgrass, even in some cases a little bit of the creeping wild rye, but you don't see any of that in the interior of the field, just basically along those fence lines. So by utilizing grazing, it's our hope that we're going to be able to increase fertility, increase soil structure so that those outside grasses can sort of move their way in. So because of that annual grass and some restrictions, we believe probably due to the mineral cycle, not having enough nitrogen in particular, we have seeded a bunch of legumes, a couple different grasses which are a little bit more palatable, more productive, and with a longer growing cycle than the foxtail and the ripgut that's out here. So we're trying to extend our growing season. There's also a little bit of radish. You can see the little white flowers, those are little forage radishes. And so they're going down there, they're breaking up the compaction. Aldo Leopold said that fertility is a piece of ground's ability to accept, hold, and then release energy. And so what we're trying to do here is make sure that the structure of the soil through the radishes is made more open, is more capable of accepting that fertility, that we have more of the nitrogen balancing, which has allowed greater plant productivity. We're capturing more solar energy, storing it in the ground, and extending these growing seasons. This overseeding bit also has the added benefit that we're putting more weight on our animals. They are exploding. So this is one of our little test plots here where we've fenced that out to make sure that the sheep and cattle can't get after it. And then we're going to kind of watch to see how places where they did graze respond relative to the stuff that we held them out of. Something that's very important to me, and I don't know where this falls in sort of scientific research, is bricks. So if you think about it, a plant is a giant solar energy collector. Well, each individual is a tiny solar collector, and then that adds up to an entire landscape of solar energy collector. And the more efficient that your plants are at accepting sunlight, utilizing water, and making more sugar, that's all feeding all the microbiology in your soil. It's also feeding the life above your soil. So animal productivity is really a function of how good you're photosynthesizing on the place. So there are some ways to calculate plant productivity, its photosynthetic capacity. Some of them are really expensive by sending it out to a lab. Some of them, it costs, $30, $50 for a refractometer. But the thing that you all have that's free is your own mouth. So not where the animals have dunged, but if you just take some of that grass and give it a chew, you can taste how sweet it is and actually measure how much sugar you got in your landscape. We've been following a couple different researchers and a very interesting hypothesis that I think kind of holds true. It turns out that insects and other pests don't have as complex a microbiome in their gut. They don't have as many enzymes, and therefore they have a really, really difficult time digesting complex carbohydrates. They only really can digest these really simple sugars. So photosynthesis is producing simple sugars, but then if you can produce enough of them fast, then what that plant is going to do, it's going to make these longer chain carbohydrates. It's going to polymerize those sugars. And what it turns out, this hypothesis goes that insects at around 8 bricks have a very, very difficult time digesting. And once you get to 12 bricks, they really can't digest. So what your pest is would switch, because then who likes that better is the deer. Well, if the deer like it, we know our sheep are going to like it better. So by really trying to get those bricks up, we kind of actually decrease the insect predation on our plants and ended up with more weight on the animals. These grasses all grew up with grazers. Their evolution happened at the same time. And what we, I think, all think about now is that the animals are dependent on the grass. We don't think about it the other way around. The grasses have all developed specific strategies both to cope with and to thrive under a certain amount of managed grazing. A problem comes when you leave the animals there for long enough time that they're overgrazing. And overgrazing, we kind of define that from the plant's perspective. So have you been able to recover from the first bite at the time the second bite takes place? That's how I define overgrazing. With these animals, by moving them every day or every couple of days, as the case may be, we're capable of getting that impact on the grasses, on the actual ground, and then moving them off and giving that grass enough time to respond and to recover from that first bite. Undergrazing is a problem, overgrazing is a problem, and I like to think of grazing then as being just about the same thing as exercise is for a person. So you can overtrain or you can be totally sedentary, and both of those are conditions whereby you are not healthy. By having some grazing and hitting this sweet spot where you have enough of an impact and then also enough time to recover, that's where the landscape is healthy. So what we have behind me are a number of grass-fed steers, and we are blowing a lot of old paradigms out of the water. We bought these from a couple of cow-calf operations that are just neighbors of ours, and we're sitting with 3 of them that are up to their 1,200 pound finishing weight. And that's not all that significant until you put in the fact that they're grass-fed to get to that finishing weight. And then really I think the big bombshell is that they're all under 20 months old. So under 20 months, above 1,200 pounds on grass the whole time. What blew my mind when I first got involved in cattle is the fact of they're all sold multiple times during the course of their life. So you have a cow-calf operation, and that's one specialist, and for the most part all that operation is doing is just raising calves and selling weaned calves. They become stockers, and then they have a long time of getting their frame up, and then once they have their frame up they look like gangly teenagers with no meat on their bones, and then you kind of put some weight on them, and once you get to, relatively speaking, depends on the frame of the cattle, but you're trying to get to this 1,200 pound window, and you're trying to do it in under 30 months. 30 months is when you have to start doing a lot more carcass weight based on USDA regulations. So seeing cows get up to weight is done most time effectively on grain. You can put a lot more calories into them in a much shorter period of time. If you have good grass though, I think you can compete. And so doing this in under 24 months, we feel really, really good about that. So I think for me, nature is so gigantic, and there's so much richness and so much diversity and complexity, and you can miss the forest for the trees, or you can miss the trees for the forest, right? It kind of goes both ways, and your frame of view, I think, is really important. The Alan Savory's holistic management model says you can look at nature through 4 kind of big picture ways: water cycle, mineral cycle, solar energy capture, and the community dynamics. And I think that ends up becoming a really great frame of reference. So if we look at our solar energy capture and infiltration rate. Those two things alone. We don't see any water, even though we had a really wet year, on the surface. It's all made it down into the ground, and then we have this high Brix number, and that means we have more productive grass, which means we're gonna get fatter cows sooner. If you get that Brix number high, you're gonna have more productive animals. That's just as simple as that. So up there on that hill, we have not grazed that yet, but we also didn't overseed that. And then down there, as you start come down the hill, you get to this little bottom, and that's much, much darker green. So that's all been overseeded. The species in there, I believe, are triticale, bunker triticale, little crimson clover, lana vetch, and then the forage radish, the Graza forage radish. And that is, I mean, like I said, we're changing the soil structure, we're changing the chemical makeup through more nitrogen, those legumes, and all of that is increasing the forage amount. So relative to the unseeded things, we're reckoning 4 or 5-fold increases in biomass, but it's also setting into motion a longer growing season, which means we're gonna be able to graze that longer. Each year, you graze just a couple more days than you did the year before, you're adding to that soil bank. You're storing up more energy, you're storing up more water. It becomes this self-fulfilling positive feedback loop.